Let's start with a very interesting story from Flatten Inner Tube. Want to start production without the letter of credit? TL, DR at bottom. This story goes back to the mid-1990s when I was working for a company that made small metering pumps used in the manufacture of many products. The biggest market was in the spinning of synthetic fiber, an industry that literally touches all of us, except nudists and cotton-only folks, every day. In broad terms, the fiber material starts out as a liquid solution, rayon, viscose fiber, acrylics, or a molten polymer, polyester, nylon, polypropylene, etc. The pumps push the fluid through a spinneret at a very precise flow rate, creating the filament that's made into the fiber. At that time, an average plant would have 75 of the pumps in service. A really big plant would have as many as 1,100. One plant that made cigarette filter material had a couple of thousand running at any given time. I was working in the international group when I got a fax, mid-90s remember, from our commissioned agent Joseph in India. He wanted me to call him at home to discuss something. He had a customer that was willing to buy 340 pumps for a fiber plant. Joe asked if we could increase his commission from 10% to 15%. It seemed that the end user's purchasing guy wanted to, set up his retirement fund. Corporate policy permitted such things if it was local custom and if it was signed off by the GM. It was customary, and it was approved. In short order, a $640,000 order rolled in. I'm a hero, as it's the biggest order of the year. But the order has the caveat from Joe to not start production until the letter of credit was in hand. This was about 30 weeks before the end of the fiscal year. The pumps had a lead time of 16 weeks, so 14 weeks to get the LC. Piece of cake. Manufacturing and the GM were of course eager to get things going. Shipping the pumps in the current fiscal year would make a pretty good impact on the shipping dollars and would probably be enough to get the GM into bonus territory. So predictably, the GM is pushing the manufacturing folks to get started. The manufacturing folks were on us like hobos on ham sandwiches looking for permission to start manufacturing. First it was weekly, then about 10 weeks out from the drop-dead start date, it went to twice a week, then to daily. We refused to release the order because no LC was in hand. I was chasing Joe a couple of times a week for the LC. He kept getting reassurances that it was coming. On a trip to India, I went with Joe to the customer to see when we could expect the LC. It is coming? Well, okay. So a week before the drop-dead date, no LC. I was in my sales manager Tim's office when the head of manufacturing comes waltzing in looking for the release. Tim looked at him and said, "Our agent says don't start without an LC. We want to trust him, but make them if you want." Production started the next day. These pumps were mostly standard. Mostly. You see, the pumping bits were mounted on a casting that extended down to a foot that fit between two trunnions. The assembly would be pinched between the trunnions and pivoted over onto a gear on a line shaft. The pump had a gear on its drive shaft. It meshed with the line shaft gear and the pump turned. If this seems weird, it is the finest 1928 technology that allows a failed pump to be isolated and hot swapped. See this picture for some clarity on the weirdness. The standard angle on that trunnions was 90 degrees. But not these pumps. These were 105 degrees for some reason, so 340 pumps were made with non-standard ports, and if the LC never came, manufacturing is stuck with 340 oddball pumps. And the LC never came. Year-end hits, and the pumps are finished goods in inventory at $640,000. The real problems start when the GM ends up catching hell from the corporate offices in Illinois about the excessive inventory. Shit slides downhill, so sales marketing catches hell too. Joe found out later that the purchasing guy didn't have the authority to buy $500,000 in pumps. He was just trying to line his pockets. Shocking, right? Where's the malicious compliance? You want us to release the order? We'll release the order. Don't blame us if it goes sideways. Addendum. 4 months later, I managed to find another company in another country to buy the pumps, complete with the weird 105-degree trunnions mount. Did I get any credit for that? Of course not. I left the company shortly thereafter, being on the outs with my boss for other reasons, and on the outs with manufacturing for letting them make those damn pumps. TLDR big order is secured with the proviso to not start manufacturing without the LC to pay for it. Management gets greedy, jumps the gun, makes the pumps, can't ship them, catches hell for inventory, and almost eats the order. The malicious compliance was executed flawlessly. The GM's greed led to his downfall as he ignored clear warnings and rushed production. When the LC never arrived, the consequences hit hard, proving that blind ambition without caution can be devastating. The next story from Elitist. Political signs can only go up 30 days before any election? Okay. So back in August, my wife and I decided we wanted to put up a sign to promote our preferred candidate for the upcoming presidential election here in Texas. I wanted to see what my town's ordinances said about what and where we could put the sign up, as we were planning to put a banner on our fence that is very prominent facing traffic that goes along the side of our house, but that is at the edge of our property. The ordinances had a few rules about where the sign could and couldn't be, e.g., don't put them on a utility pole, the max size of the sign, 36 square feet, how high off the ground, etc. It also said that political signs would be allowed 30 days prior to any election. Note here it didn't say the election, which would have implied that the election had to be related to the sign. As far as I was concerned, it could be, as the ordinance said in plain English, any election. So we ordered a 36 square foot banner off of Etsy, nailed and tied it to the fence on a Saturday in August. The next Monday, code enforcement dropped by and said something along the lines, "We had an inquiry about your sign. It isn't in compliance with the ordinance," and asked us to take it down. I wasn't home at the time. My wife told him that I wasn't home, but that I had read the ordinance and it said any election, and that we were in compliance. There was some back and forth. They settled on, if you request a sign permit that would give us a month with the sign up, then we would be within 30 days of early voting in Texas, which is how the town has traditionally interpreted the meaning of 30 days prior to any election. So I get home from running the errand I was on, and my wife tells me what has transpired. I still thought the sign was legal under the ordinance, but to make my wife happy, I applied for and was granted the permit. 2 days later, the same code enforcement officer came to our house and said that the town manager had overruled his issuing of the permit and that the sign needed to come down. I told him that I only applied for the permit to make my wife happy, and that the sign has always been legal under the ordinance, and that the town was not without choices, as it could clean up the language in the ordinance. More back and forth. I asked him what the next steps were, you know. Do you remove the sign would have made great footage from my security camera? Do you cite me? Etc., etc. He said he would talk to the town manager. I said that I would be happy to discuss it with the town manager. So the town manager calls me later that day. Says things like, most people don't put 36 square foot signs on residential property. I told him that I wasn't most people. That I was following the letter of the ordinance and that the sign was up in accordance with any election, including the fact that several of the 54 primaries are currently happening, and that those are all elections for the purposes of the ordinance. He says that he would contact the town's lawyer. Hours later, he calls back. I guess the town's lawyer was not busy that day and was able to opine instantly on the matter. He says the town's lawyer thinks the ordinance is enforceable, but that they have decided to not take an enforcement action. I told him I still believed I was in compliance because I was following the any election provision, but that he was making the right choice, as there was a pandemic going on. But I had also been doing some research. Many people think of Texas as very similar to the rest of the South, where local government is best. But my understanding of how things work in Texas is that cities and towns cannot do things that the state doesn't allow them to do. So things are often enumerated or restricted at the state level. And it just so happens that Texas has a chapter on political signs. Title 15 is Regulating Political Funds and Campaigns, and Chapter 259 is political signs. 259.003 is titled Regulation of Political Signs by Municipality and says in part, a municipal charter provision or ordinance that regulates signs may not, for a sign that contains primarily a political message and that is located on private real property with the consent of the property owner, prohibit the sign from being placed. It looks like there are some caveats elsewhere in the chapter, such as it applies to signs 36 square feet and smaller, etc., but definitely applies to my circumstances. So the town's ordinance restricts someone from placing a political sign 30 days before any election. It sure seems like that violates this section of Texas law. Now armed with some information, I went to town council and spoke at one of the open forums where residents can address the council on any topic. My town is pretty small, full of people who don't share my political views, and the council reflects that pretty well. But I told them about how the ordinance appeared to violate Texas law. I also told them about a recent Supreme Court ruling from 2015 that set a bit of a surprising precedent. Basically, under certain conditions, the town might have to survive strict scrutiny when taking enforcement actions on signs and demonstrate a narrowly tailored, compelling government interest for why certain signs could only be up for short times versus other signs being up for longer times. Anyway, the town has worked with me on this issue, and the town manager is a busy person, but did say that the town's lawyer and him would circle up and propose changes to council in the coming months. I hope this post inspires you to get out there and vote and also engage with your government at the local, state, and national level. The malicious compliance was executed flawlessly. By adhering strictly to the ordinance's vague wording, the OP exposed the town's overreach. Backing it with state law and Supreme Court precedent forced officials to back down. A masterclass in using rules against the rulemakers. The next story from Rust and Dirt. Dump truck delivery. 20 plus years ago now, I worked at a landscaping supply business driving a dump truck. I've been a software engineer for most of the time since, but at that time, well, mistakes were made, and I spent a few years driving a truck. These were single axle trucks, 26,000 pounds gross. We often overloaded them by about a ton. Mascouta was on the edge of the area we often delivered to, and we occasionally took rock or mulch to the high school there. I arrived one day with probably 4 or 5 tons of topsoil. If I recall correctly, I had to drive around the school and find someone. I suspect I'd been instructed on where to meet people, and those people weren't there. I asked after the name I had on the delivery ticket. It was written on there like I should know who they were. When I found someone behind the school and was informed that it was a math or physics, I don't recall, but something STEM-related teacher I was looking for. I think I asked that person if they could find the teacher for me. Eventually, I met the teacher and 3 or 4 students in front of the school. I didn't know any of them. I might have still been 19 or 20 at the time, and I looked young. It wasn't rare to be forced to find people for a delivery, and everything was normal so far. I got out of the truck and was told that the dirt was to be dumped into a planter they had been assembling with decorative blocks around the sign for the high school. It was out, maybe 50 feet into the grass between the road and the parking lot in front of the school. I hesitated and might have managed to say, before being interrupted. I was going to say that the truck would leave marks in the grass. The truck, at 12,000 pounds empty, was heavy enough that it would compress the dirt, and even though the grass would only be flattened, it would leave a trail anywhere the truck went, likely an inch or 2 deep that wouldn't go away anytime soon. The tracks would be conspicuous. I don't recall if I got more than 1 syllable out before I was interrupted with a condescending tone, initially from the teacher and then from 1 or 2 of the students. I tried to speak again, and again I was met with a mix of disbelief that I didn't understand the instructions, and further attempts to explain what they wanted me to do as though I was 5 years old or didn't speak English. I believe I attempted to speak 2 or 3 times before giving up. I acquiesced, got back in the truck, and proceeded to drive out into the grass, leaving ruts that the groundskeepers would regret for years to come. The grass will be cut off level above these ruts, but you'll still feel them when you drive over them with a mower. I backed the truck up to one side of the planter and dumped dirt in until it was piled above the small semi-oval retaining wall, and I was signaled to stop. The sign was in the middle of the planter, which meant that the pile was only on one side. The other side was pretty much empty. I expected that we would want to drive to the other side of planter. When you dump enough piles of something, you get a feel for what it's going to take to fill a space. But after being told to stop, I got out to suggest that they would want more dirt here to fill the entire planter. Again, I was not able to finish a sentence. I attempted to tell them that when they spread the dirt out in the planter, it wasn't going to be anywhere near the brim. I also would have been willing to stay while they moved some dirt over to the bare area so we could dump more in without spilling out onto the grass. It was clear they had no use for anything I might have to say. The disrespect was clearly intentional. I'm not sure if there was some perceived slight, or if this was just a wolf pack who did this to everyone. I was told to go dump the remaining soil. There was probably 2 or 3 tons left in the truck. It could have been put to good use in the planter still, out in a row crop field back behind the school. Here's another intricacy of working with a dump truck you might not intuit. Dirt doesn't spread evenly out of a dump bed. Most trucks have chains for the gate that allow you to meter how quickly the material comes out of the truck. These work great with small rock and gravel. With material that's more prone to clumping, you set the chains such that the gate can open wider and be less prone to clogging. But for dirt and mulch, it effectively just doesn't work. It hits the gate, compacts a bit, and is clogged. Then you can't release the chains because there are thousands of pounds of material pressed against it. You have to dig it out, which is a lot of work, even with gravity helping. And of course, the whole exercise was futile from the start. Thankfully, these people didn't know to ask, or I'm sure they would have directed me how to do my job, and then I would have been faced with either arguing with people who didn't care what I thought, or setting the chains and then spending 10 minutes unclogging the gate of the truck. You might guess there's too much nuance in that to convey in a scenario where I've yet to be allowed to finish a sentence. We weren't having a conversation, and these people were enjoying this for some reason. This was a long time ago, and I don't remember much of what was said to me, but I do clearly remember one kid slowly explaining, "Just take the truck over there and drive while you dump it out," or something to that effect, with hand gestures, like you would explain something to a child. By this point, I wouldn't piss on them if they were on fire, so I wasn't inclined to expose myself to any more of this noise. I had them sign for the delivery, and then drove around the school and into the field. I felt a little bad for whoever farmed this field, so I actually did try to make it work as well as possible. I also doubted they had permission. I drove about as fast as I was willing to drive in a recently tilled field and started raising the bed. As topsoil is wont to do, nothing happened until the entire mass started sliding and essentially landed in the field in a large pile. You could tell that, if you knew what you were looking at, the truck had been moving when it was dumped, but it was still a pile that someone was going to have to deal with. I drove past the school a week or so later on another delivery. I was curious to see if they had gone out to the field to get some of the nice sifted topsoil when they realized the planter was barely half filled, or to maybe use it to patch the ruts in the grass. There were still obvious tracks leading to the newly constructed planter. The planter was half filled with dirt, leaving the back of multiple courses of block exposed, and the large pile of dirt was still standing out in the field. The planter stayed that way for years. I don't know if anyone ever fixed it. The entire complex was apparently demolished and has been replaced with a new building now. I moved out of the area a long time ago. I'm not entirely certain that this was malicious compliance. I wasn't trying to be malicious, but I wasn't going to argue with people who were being both insulting and borderline hostile. I held that job way too long, maybe 6 years, so I certainly had more bad or weird encounters with customers, like the time I guess I disappointed a couple trying to have a delivery man three-way. But this one was one of the worst. The malicious compliance was perfect and was executed with patience and precision. The truck ruts, half-filled planter, and abandoned dirt pile were poetic justice for the arrogant teacher and students. Their refusal to listen ensured their own failure. making the compliance both satisfying and deserved.